She walked into the king's court, uninvited. And in that empire, that meant one thing: death. No debate, no mercy. One wrong step, and her life would end before a single word could leave her mouth. But if she stayed silent, an entire people would disappear without a fight. This was not a moment of emotion. It was a calculated risk, taken by someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Because in a kingdom ruled by absolute power, access was controlled, voices were limited, and consequences were final. Yet she walked forward anyway, not because she was fearless, but because she knew the cost of doing nothing would be far greater than the cost of stepping in. This is the story of how one woman, positioned in a place she never expected to be, became the only barrier between survival and destruction, between silence and action, between a signed decree and a chance to change what seemed already decided. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How did Esther, an orphan in exile, a young woman with no title, no influence, and no clear future, become queen of the most powerful empire on earth? In a system where status was everything and outsiders were often overlooked, her rise was not just unusual, it was almost unexplainable. And then there was Haman, a man who did not start as an enemy to a nation, but whose pride and position grew into something far more dangerous. A man who gained the trust of a king and used that trust to push a decision that would put thousands of lives at risk. What kind of influence does it take to convince a ruler to approve something so extreme without fully understanding its consequences? And at the center of it all stood Mordecai, a man who saw beyond what others could see, who understood the weight of the moment and believed that Esther's position was not an accident, but a responsibility. Why did he believe she had been placed in that palace for this exact moment? And what did he see that she had not yet realized? Long before she stood at the center of a life or death decision, Esther, also known as Hadassah, was simply a young woman trying to survive in a world that did not favor people like her. She had no parents, no protection of her own, and no place of influence. Everything she knew about stability came from one man, Mordecai. He was not just her guardian. He was her guide, the one who raised her, taught her, and helped her understand how to live carefully in a land that was not truly theirs. Because they were living under Persian rule, part of a people who had been scattered across a powerful empire, where survival often depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Their lives were quiet, controlled, and shaped by a system that did not bend easily for outsiders. And above that system stood King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I, a ruler with complete authority, a man whose word could build or destroy without question. In an empire like this, power was not debated, it was not challenged, and it was not negotiated. It was absolute. And once a decision was made, it was expected to be followed without hesitation. It began during a royal feast, the kind that displayed not just wealth, but control. King Ahasuerus sat at the center of it all, surrounded by officials, nobles, and men who understood that being in that room meant more than celebration. It meant alignment with power. Food was abundant, wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere carried a sense of confidence that only absolute authority can create. And then, in the middle of that moment, the king made a request. He called for Queen Vashti. On the surface, it seemed simple, just an appearance, a presentation before his guests. But in a system like that, nothing was ever just a request. It was a demonstration of order, a reminder of who held control and how far that control extended. But Vashti refused. No hesitation, no negotiation, just a refusal that broke the expected pattern. And in that instant, the mood shifted. Advisors exchanged looks, not out of confusion, but out of concern. Because if the queen could say no, then the structure they all depended on began to look fragile. If one voice could resist, what would stop others from doing the same? The issue was no longer about Vashti. It was about maintaining authority across an entire empire. And so the response came quickly. She was removed. Not quietly, not temporarily, but completely. And just like that, the throne beside the king became empty, creating a space that would soon be filled by someone no one was expecting. What followed was not a search for love, it was a search for control. The empire moved quickly to fill the space Vashti had left behind, and a decree went out across the land, calling for young women to be brought into the palace, prepared, observed, and eventually presented before King Ahasuerus. It was a process that removed choice and replaced it with selection, where outcomes were determined by what the king saw in a single moment. Among those brought into this system was Esther. She entered quietly, just as she had lived, guided by Mordecai's instruction to remain careful, to observe more than she revealed, and most importantly, to keep her identity hidden. Inside the palace, she was placed under the care of Haggai, the man responsible for preparing the women, and while others focused on standing out, Esther relied on something different: awareness. She understood that in a place like this, survival was not about attention. It was about timing, restraint, and knowing what not to say. Esther did not reveal who she was, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that sometimes silence is survival. And when the moment came for her to stand before King Ahasuerus, she did not force attention, she held it, and that difference mattered. She was chosen. In an instant, her position changed from invisible to influential, from overlooked to central. But while Esther rose quietly into a place of power, another man was rising in a very different way, not through selection, but through ambition, and his name was Haman. Haman did not rise by accident. He was elevated by King Ahasuerus into a position that placed him above the other officials, a role that carried authority, visibility, and expectation. People were required to bow as he passed, not as a suggestion, but as a sign of respect for the power he now held. And for most, that was not a difficult choice. But Mordecai refused. Not loudly, not publicly, but consistently. He would not bow. And what could have remained a quiet disagreement became something much deeper in Haman's mind. It was no longer about protocol, it became personal. Because in a system built on recognition and status, refusal feels like a direct challenge. And Haman was not the kind of man to overlook it. His anger did not rush. It settled, it grew, and it began to shape a plan that went far beyond Mordecai alone. Instead of targeting one man, he chose to target an entire people, the Jews, Mordecai's people, Esther's people. He approached King Ahasuerus carefully, presenting the issue in a way that aligned with the king's interest in order and control, describing a group that lived differently, followed different laws, and could not be fully trusted. And without being told the full truth, without understanding who would be affected, the king agreed. The decree was written, sealed, and sent across the empire. A date was set, not for negotiation, not for warning, but for destruction. An entire people marked for death by a decision made in a moment of influence. And the only person close enough to stop it was Esther, the queen, the one woman with access to the king, and the one person who had not told anyone who she really was. When Mordecai learned what had been set in motion, he did not respond with confusion. He responded with urgency, because he understood exactly what the decree meant and how little time remained before its consequences would reach every corner of the empire. He sent word to Esther, not as a request, but as a message that carried weight, reminding her that her position in the palace did not separate her from what was coming. Do not think that because you are in the palace you will escape, he told her, making it clear that silence would not protect her. It would only delay the inevitable. And then he said something that shifted everything, something that moved beyond fear and into purpose. And who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It was not just a statement. It was a challenge, a call to recognize that her position might not be accidental, that the path that brought her there could be connected to what was happening now. And for Esther, that realization created a conflict she could not ignore, because she understood the risk better than anyone. To approach King Ahasuerus without being summoned was forbidden. It was not a small rule. It was a law enforced with finality. Anyone who entered the king's presence uninvited could be put to death unless the king chose to extend mercy. There was no guarantee, no negotiation, no second chance. And Esther knew this. She knew that stepping forward meant placing her life in the hands of a single reaction, a single decision that could not be predicted. But she also understood what would happen if she did nothing. And in that space between fear and responsibility, she made a choice. She called for a fast, asking others to join her, not as a ritual without meaning, but as preparation, as focus, as a way to steady herself for what she was about to do. Because this was no longer just a decision about her safety. It was a moment that would define everything, not only for her, but for everyone connected to what had already been set in motion. The moment arrived without ceremony, without warning, just a decision carried out in real time. Esther stepped forward toward the inner court of King Ahasuerus, fully aware of what that action meant. Every step carried risk. Every second stretched longer than it should, and the distance between her and the throne felt heavier than it looked. No one spoke. No one moved. Because everyone in that space understood the law, and they understood what could happen next. Esther stopped at a distance, her posture steady, her expression controlled, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. And then the king looked at her. A pause, long enough to matter. And in that pause, everything rested on a single decision. Then slowly, King Ahasuerus extended the golden scepter. It was a small gesture, but it changed everything. What could have ended in silence shifted into opportunity. Esther stepped closer, not rushing, not forcing the moment, but understanding that timing mattered just as much as courage. She did not reveal everything at once. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Then another. She allowed the moment to build, to draw attention, to create the space needed for truth to land with impact. And when that moment finally came, she spoke. Not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. She revealed who she was. She revealed her people, and she revealed the plan that had been set in motion against them. In that moment, the issue was no longer distant or abstract. It was standing in front of the king, and the reaction was immediate. The shift in power was clear. What had once been influence quietly shaping decisions was now exposed in full view. Haman stood revealed, no longer protected by position or perception. And King Ahasuerus, now aware of what had been approved under his authority, responded not as a distant ruler, but as someone directly confronted with the consequences of that decision. In a matter of moments, everything changed. The problem, however, was not solved in a single moment, because the decree that had been issued could not simply be erased. In the laws of the empire, once a command carried the king's seal, it stood as final. It could not be undone, withdrawn, or rewritten. And that reality meant that even though Haman had been exposed, even though the truth had come to light, the danger was still in motion. The date remained. The threat remained. The outcome still had the potential to unfold exactly as it had been planned. But this time, the king understood what was at stake, and instead of ignoring it, he responded. A new decree was issued, not to cancel the first, but to counter it. Authority was given for the Jews to defend themselves, to prepare, and to stand against what had been set in motion. What was meant for destruction began to shift into something else, something that allowed for resistance, for strategy, and for survival. And when the day finally came, it did not unfold as expected. The people who had once been marked for death were no longer waiting in silence. They were ready. And the same system that had been used against them became the very structure that allowed them to survive. Haman was removed, his position no longer a shield, his influence no longer a factor. And in the end, what had begun as a quiet plan driven by pride and control became a turning point, not just an outcome, but an understanding how quickly power can shift when truth is brought into the open. History remembers kings like Ahasuerus. It records their power, their authority, and the decisions that shaped entire nations. But moments like this remind us of something deeper, something that goes beyond titles and positions, because influence does not always come from the throne. It does not always belong to the person with the highest authority, and it does not always announce itself before it acts. Sometimes, it comes from someone placed in a position they did not choose, facing a moment they cannot avoid, and understanding that what they do next will shape everything that follows. Esther did not start with power. She did not begin with influence. And she did not enter the palace with a plan to change the course of events. But when the moment came, she made a decision that carried weight far beyond herself. A decision that required courage, awareness, and a willingness to act when the outcome was uncertain. And that is what gives this story its lasting impact. Not just what happened, but what it reveals about what is possible when someone chooses to step forward instead of remain silent. So the question is not just about Esther. It is about perspective, because if you were in her position with the same risk, the same uncertainty, and the same understanding of what was at stake, would you have taken that step, or would you have remained where it felt safe? Let me know in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the next one might change how you see everything.